Hi there, welcome to randytv.com, and got our first interview person, a very good friend of mine, Stephen Hassan. Many of you are familiar with him. Stephen is a former Moonie. And Guilty. He was deprogrammed by his parents. I'll let him tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But in the process of educating himself afterwards, he developed a new approach. Tell us about your early beginnings with, or your experience with the Moonie Church and what actually happened, Steve.
Very briefly, I was 19 and I was an upper junior at Queens College in New York, and my girlfriend had dumped me, and 3 attractive women came to my table in the cafeteria at Queens College and started flirting with me and pretended to be students, and little did I know, but they were agents of the Moon organization, recruiting on campus. And
is that their primary place of recruitment?
In the 70s in particular, they were very active on campuses. I'd say now they're more active on the internet than on campuses specifically.
Really?
Yeah. But long story short, I shared lots of personal information with them. They were very good and skilled recruiters, and they lied to me. They didn't tell me what it was about. In fact, I even asked, are you part of a religious group? Oh no, not at all. We're just a group of students. In the meantime, they were bowing to an altar with Moon's picture on it, believing he was the Messiah, and believing that the Armageddon was going to happen.
When did Sun Moon get started in his messiahship?
Well, he was born in 1920, and he claims when he was 16, Jesus came to him and asked him to finish his unfinished ministry. Because Moon says that Jesus should have married, had sinless children, the Jews should have marched on Rome and should have taken over the world, and we should have had this master race of super Jesus people all over the world. But because he messed up and John the Baptist didn't become a good convert, he had to go to the way of the cross, which was a big failure. And so Moon has to come 2,000 years later. The blessing was taken from Israel, brought to Korea, the master race.
So he's basically the Messiah finishing his job?
Yes, he is the greatest perfect man in human history, God's creation, and his wife
has no
sinless.
family problems whatsoever.
Well, that's part of the problem with being sinless. And remember the mass weddings of the Moonies, where he says you and you, and you're supposed to have sinless children. Well, the Messiah's own children, one became a coke addict and was addicted to prostitutes, another one died jumping out of a window of a hotel in Reno. Lots of stories with the Moonies, but to cut to the chase.
Back to your how you got it.
For me, I was very caught up in the fervor that God had chosen me, and that we were living at the end times, and that God had a plan, and that Soviet Union was going to be in this final war with the United States. It was Armageddon-like war, and that God had this plan to create paradise on earth, the kingdom of heaven on earth.
Now this goes back to what, the early 80s, late 70s? So
the Moonies, the organization Korea was officially founded, I'm told, in 1954, but Moon came to the United States the first time in 1965 and really started getting going in the early 70s, and I was recruited in February of 74, so I was one of the first of the American leaders who were being groomed. And
so you were actually in the leadership of Moon?
Yeah, they were looking for American front people. Like, Americans had no power. We were just good talkers. We could talk to the media. We could give lectures and stuff.
Better PR to have a Caucasian Asian back then.
And we knew how to recruit other Americans. The Koreans really didn't know how to recruit. So, but I was very involved. I was sleeping maybe 3 to 4 hours a night, working 7 days a week for no pay, cut off from my family because they were evil, because they said I was in a cult, so I was told stay away from them. And as we mentioned before, I had this van crash. I fell asleep at the wheel of the van because of sleep exhaustion, broke my leg, and it was in the context of being in the hospital that I reached out to my sister, and she said, come and visit, you have a nephew you haven't met, and I got permission to do that, and that's where my parents sprung the intervention with me. And I was absolutely convinced I wasn't brainwashed, I was making my own choices, that I was just having a spiritual experience, doing God's will, being a saint on earth.
Like we all did.
Yeah, and for me, one of the critical things was being exposed to Robert Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, who was a military intelligence agent, psychiatrist for the Air Force in the 50s, studying Chinese communist re-education programs. And he outlined 8 criteria by which an environment may be judged as the brainwashing, or what he called the thought reform environment.
Right.
And it was going through those criteria that it became really obvious that the Moonies did every single one of them.
Now, as a pause on that, I've had people object to me that he did not have cults in mind at all. He does not apply it to cults. And I know that's false because he's given lectures on applying it to cults. How does he see the connection between Chinese thought reform and modern day techniques?
Good question. So when he wrote the book that was published in 1961, was about Chinese communist brainwashing, and he did not have cults in mind at all. And
exactly.
It was actually when I called him 3 months after I got out of the Moonies, I said, Dr. Lifton, your book was instrumental in helping me get out of this group. He said, that old book, tell me why. And I said, well, I was recruited. We did the 3-day workshop, the 7-day workshop, the 21-day workshop, the 40-day workshop. He said, come and see me. So we met in person, and he's the one most responsible for my career today, because as he was listening, he said, this is much more sophisticated than what we were studying. And besides, I only studied it secondhand, but you've lived it. They did it to you, and you did it to other people. So you need to study psychology and explain it to people like me. And I was sitting there, a depressed, college dropout, former Moonie, with this eminent Yale psychiatrist telling me that I actually had something of value from this experience. So it really changed my head about it. He said, come to Yale, we'll do a book together. So back to your question about it, he actually wrote a book about Om Shinrikyo, the Japanese nerve gas cult, called Destroying the World to Save It, about apocalyptic cults, and specifically applied his 8 criteria.
He applied his 8 criteria to
in that particular volume.
So to this day, he definitely sees a direct connection.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I haven't seen him. He has a memoir that came out about a year ago, and I actually sat down and interviewed him about his memoir. It's on my Vimeo.com/Freedom of Mind site. And in fact, I'm going out to...
What's the name of your site again? People want to find it.
So my website is freedomofmind.com.
Freedomofmind.com.
But I don't have Randy TV. You're way ahead of me.
Well, this starts today.
I just have this Vimeo.com/freedomofmind thing where I'm
So you
uploading.
have a Vimeo site.
Yeah, and I'm putting you on it because we don't have an ex-Jehovah's Witness leader, and I want people to know you, Randy, and your work. Anyway, to come back to the story of the Combating came out, you wrote to me, I said, why should I mention Jehovah's Witness? You said, you wrote about my group. I said, teach me. You said, come out to LA. I'll introduce you to some of my friends. And you organized a lecture and a workshop, and I flew out.
Oh yeah, that's when we had the church, and half of the church was ex-witnesses.
Yeah, and that began my education about the Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult. And then I started, at the time, the Cult Awareness Network was the major organization.
Which I joined too.
Which was another organization, was American Family Foundation, that changed their name more recently to International Cultic Studies Association. But I said, the Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult. They're like, no, they're not. And I'm like, yes, they are. They fit all the criteria. They said, no, they're too big. I said big is not the criteria. Old is not the criteria. The criteria of Lifton's
Does
8 things.
Does that make Stalin more credible because he's big?
Right, but it took years for them to get that the Jehovah's Witnesses were, walk like a duck, quack like a duck, feathers like a duck.
Right.
A mind control group. So I credit you for my education, opening up my eyes to the Jehovah's Witnesses. I can't thank you enough about that. And fortunately, my books have helped lots of people. I've been asked to do.
I recommend this combating all the time. Now, my impression is that combating cult mind control is for a person who wants to help a person in a cult, whereas releasing the bonds is for a person who wants to get it out of their head. Is that too simplistic?
No, that's actually not right.
Okay.
As the author.
Now's the time to explain the difference
So
between
I should say
your
that
3 books. You've got a new one that just came out.
Yeah, this is the one that I want people to pay attention
Helping
to.
loved ones leave controlling people, cults, and beliefs.
Yeah.
So tell me.
So this just came out in July.
Refute me on what I just said.
Well, I wrote Combating. It was really about my story. How I got into the Moonies and my job getting people out of groups. So it was kind of a basic primer on what is mind control. In fact, in my chapter on mind control, I didn't call it then the BITE model, but I talked about the 4 components.
That's when you were developing that.
Thought control, emotional control, information control, and behavior control. And it was only years later that a minister named Buddy Martin, who was helping me with International Church of Christ cases, Kip McKean cases, he said, if you change the order, you can call it the BITE model. And it's become the BITE model ever since.
And that's based on a combination of Lifton's ideas and your own experience.
Well, it's totally based on Lifton and Singer's 6 conditions, but really what it's based on is Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory, who wrote one of the first books about cults.
Excellent
He wrote a book called When Prophecies.
Read a book by Leon Festinger.
When Prophecy Fails, about a UFO cult.
That was one of my favorite books.
And he talked about cognitive dissonance theory, and he said there are thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and people want to be consistent. So if you change a thought, they're going to feel differently and they're going to behave differently. Or if you change their behavior, they're going to feel differently about the behavior and think differently about the behavior. And it works anyway with those 3 variables.
What's the short example of what you're talking about?
So someone is an atheist, and a friend says, "That's okay, Randy, just put your hands together and let's say a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father," and then, so if you're putting your hands together to pray, you're engaging in a behavior.
Right.
Of putting your hands
You're
together.
actually entering their mindset.
Right. And if you track social psychology experiments, people's attitudes change and their feelings, because if they're doing it, well, maybe there is a God.
So is it kind of like a movie, like people who like horror movies, they lose their own awareness for the moment of an hour and a half and get into the movie type thing?
Well, that's a piece of the phenomenon, but really cognitive dissonance theory is just a way of understanding how people learn and how people adapt and how people change. And
how they can accept.
And where I plugged into it in terms of the cult phenomenon, I basically plugged in by adding information control, and then I created this model. This is a continuum where ethical influence is there and unethical influence is there. Not me, over there. And healthy influence respects people's uniqueness, their individuality, their free will. Leaders are accountable and responsible and transparent. And on this end is the cult destructive influence continuum, where people's behaviors control, their thoughts are controlled. You have to think the right thoughts. And if you don't think the right thoughts, you need to do thought stopping, or you need to be re-educated to have the right thoughts. And the right thoughts are dictated by the pyramid, the leaders of the pyramid, that tell you what the right thoughts are. Or the feelings, you're made to feel special on the one hand, but mostly it's about fear and guilt manipulation. with my focus on phobia indoctrination as the universal mind control techniques that these bad groups do. They instill people with this irrational fear that if they leave the group or even question the leadership,
it seems to start with fear.
Things are going to happen. You're going to be invaded by evil spirits. Satan's going to get you. You're going to get cancer. You're going to be hit by a car. And I have pages in the new book of the most common phobias that I deal with, and a 3-step intervention on how to undo phobias. And
now, this is in the new book?
In the new book. So combating is really kind of the overall primer, and I would have updated combating, except I have an extremely bad relationship with the publisher, and I've tried to buy the rights back for almost 20 years, and he won't sell it for even 10 times what it's worth.
Oh, I think your modern writings are much more insightful.
No, thanks.
No use in resurrecting old books.
Well, I'm working on my next book, which is more of an autobiographical
book. A 4th book?
Yes.
Nice.
I have 5 more outlined.
You work harder than almost anyone I know.
You know what? I appreciate the compliment, but there are people who, like Phil Zimbardo, who does way more than I ever could do, and he's like 20 years older than me. But
and briefly, Philip Zimbardo is one who did experiments involving mind games.
So Philip Zimbardo is one of my mentors. He's professor emeritus at Stanford University, and he did the Zimbardo prison experiment, where he took normal, healthy young men and made them into prisoners and guards and videotaped it.
And there's a word for that experiment. What, milligram?
Milgram is a different experiment.
Okay.
Milgram obedience study. This is the Zimbardo prison study. In any case, Zimbardo is one of the premier social psychologists of the last century and this century, and he actually taught a course at Stanford called The Psychology of Mind Control that used 2 chapters from Combating Cult Mind Control.
Nice.
And he's one of my biggest supporters. In fact, we stuck his endorsement on the top of there because he's so famous. And now he's doing something that I absolutely adore called the Heroic Imagination Project, where he's inspiring people to be heroes. And what he means by that is just doing the right thing and not waiting for someone else to do the right thing, but knowing that you have the chance to stand up and do the right thing for yourself and for others. And on that site, heroicimagination.org, he has a lot of clips of his own TV specials and the Zimbardo prison study, the Milgram obedience study, which is the phony shock machine where people were electrocuting another person.
That's what most people are familiar with.
Believing that they're going to teach them word pairs, but actually it was a test of obedience, and 2/3 electrocuted another person within an hour because a guy in a white coat ordered them to. But coming back to combating, and then I wrote Releasing the Bonds in 2000, and now we have the new edition, Freedom of Mind.
You can get this at Amazon.com right now.
This is really my model for how to help anybody involved with whether it's a controlling boyfriend or husband.
This is your man.
or a religious cult, a political cult, a therapy cult, a boss, anyone who's not allowing you the respect of your own mind, of your own feelings.
So you're not just dealing with religion?
Not at all.
Because religion, I mean, when we talk about these mind control or mental issues that are typical in cults, what percentage of the whole spectrum of the world's deception really kind of fits into these categories? I mean, there's a lot of political organizations that are every bit as bad or worse.
Absolutely. Well, North Korea is the quintessential mind control cult. It's really, we're at the point in human species, I think, in time and space of our evolution where we really need to come to grips with the fact that we think and we feel and we have choices, and we need to understand that we are wired to adapt to environments, and we're wired to conform to other people in our environment.
Right.
So that speaks to, if we understand that we're wired that way, it speaks to the importance of having friends in our circle who disagree with us and who aren't intimidated to say, you know what, Steve, you're full of it, or I don't agree at all with what you just said.
Right.
To keep healthy and to keep checking what is it that we are believing and doing. If you surround yourself only with people who are saying yes, or saying you have to think
Like
the
weekend
right
retreats.
way, or like extreme, political, alignments where they can't think from another point of view. There's a real problem with that. So what's the difference between releasing the bonds and freedom of mind? You had asked me before, Randy, and I really shift the emphasis away from interventions towards the prep meeting with family and the coaching.
You mean so individuals can learn to do that with their families?
Correct. But the bottom line is I feel love is stronger than mind control.
Right.
And nobody, and cults may say that they have higher love or they have God's love, but it turns out to be that destructive groups only have conditional love, conditional upon you believing what they tell you to do and you behaving the way they want you to do. Whereas if someone really loves you, they love your being, they love your essence, and
Right.
they just want you to be fulfilled. They want you to develop and express your talents and abilities. And they want to have a relationship with you. They don't want to just have an absentee brother or an absentee son or father.
That's one thing that I haven't even talked to you about. But my direction is I'm using the word primal a lot to show that man is socially evolving from basically an animal response mechanism of we're this tribe and you're that tribe and don't come near us or we'll beat you to death, to a point where they dialogue, and now we have cell phones. Anything can happen in Iraq, we know it,
Right.
in 30 seconds here, and the world cannot tolerate dictatorships. And what's amazing to me, maybe it's just my observation, but the number of dictatorships and the number of people they influence has drastically been reduced in the last few decades because people will not tolerate it. And the only reason they won't tolerate it is number one, business and money, but number two, education.
Exactly. Well said. And we're in evolution, basically.
We are in evolution.
And we have to start thinking more as global citizens, because if we have a nuclear accident here, the radioactivity is going to go there.
It's going to
What
affect
happened
every
in
person on
Japan.
Earth.
We have to start being concerned as a global entity. What I'm worried about is that the media has become more centralized. There's 5 basic conglomerates
so they have
of
a
media.
little bit too much control.
Way too much influence, to the point where if I'm asked on a major show, I'm often being told not to mention I was in the Moonies. I can
Right.
say I'm a former cult member, but not say I was in the Moonies. What's up with that? Well, the Moonies own the Washington Times newspaper. They own the broadcast facility that every major network uses in our nation's capital. So they don't, everybody's getting sensitized to not wanting to say anything that's going to hurt anyone or get them sued, whereas the media used to be looking after the public good as the number one thing. Now it's about making money and not stepping on toes. So what we need to keep going is a free internet where people can do a Randy TV. Like this recent thing with Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes that was spectacular until Scientology got smart and then settled the divorce really fast. I would do an hour interview and I'd have maybe 20-second soundbite.
Right.
And I just said, this is crazy. I'm going to sit down with a former leader and we're going to talk for 40 minutes straight about the issues, and I'm going to put it on my site so that people, if they want to know more, like some real meat, they can sit and watch for 40 minutes.
That's what they did when Heaven's Gate pulled off their suicide in San Diego. There was nobody in LA that they could reach out to. Fox News brought out a limousine and had me talk about cults and how they work, and they used probably a 3 or 4 minute segment.
Yeah.
And so people really don't find out much.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, the people going to college now, if you say Jonestown, they don't know what you're talking about. They may know the term drink the Kool-Aid, but they don't know that 913 people, 914 died, and 276
and they don't
were
know
children.
that, what's his name, the founder?
Jim Jones.
Jim Jones was a respected preacher, and the reason he got the power he did was because he stood up for human rights,
right,
and lack of racial prejudice.
Right. Yeah, that was so. One needs to separate the ideals and the beliefs and the practices. Mm-hmm. In my work, I say look at the behavior. If a group is telling you don't talk to former members, don't talk to critics, don't read this literature, mm-hmm. they're exercising information control. Just like a political dictator that doesn't want any dissidents to spread their dangerous ideas, mm-hmm. Mind control, religious groups, therapy groups, whatever, they don't want people thinking for themselves, making up their own decision based on real interaction.
Right.
And so if you're listening to this and maybe you've been involved with a group or something, think about that, because if something's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny, and you should be able to hear from the most virulent critic or the most virulent ex-member, hear what they have to say, and then use
That's
your
my
own
tactics.
own brain.
When I hear about a group or some movement and someone's attacking it, I go out and find their literature and the worst things against them, and I start there because I know that's as bad as it can get, and then I go back and find out how good it is.
Right.
And that's the best way. But if you start out with a light book that doesn't tell you everything, you're never going to find out the extent of
right.
what they're all about.
Right. Or
Same
if you
as
trust the
conspiracy
recruiter.
theories.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, well, the conspiracy theories abound, and there's a lot of bad beliefs out there, people. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea is to use all of your mind and your heart as you're living your life, not just the believing part and leaving the critical thinking part out.